Amen. Well, okay, we are picking it back up where we left off last week. This is the first week that we'll be walking through The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. Now, did everybody get a copy of The Case for Christ either on Wednesday or on Sunday? Everybody got one? Everybody good? Okay, today we are going over Chapter 1. There's not really anything to talk about from the introduction. It's certainly interesting. It introduces Lee Strobel to you, but we're going to jump straight to Chapter 1 and begin discussing the issues that Lee Strobel talks about in Chapter 1. So we're going to be talking about who wrote the Gospels. We're going to talk about when the Gospels were written, and we're going to talk about whether the Gospels are accurate. Who wrote the Gospels? When did they write them? And is the stuff they wrote in them actually true? So, did everybody get a chance to at least skim through Chapter 1 of The Case for Christ?
I did not get a chance to.
Okay, that's all right. The timeout room is over there.
I'll be there too.
That'll be $20. No, that's fine. You can just catch up for next week. So, first things first, who wrote the Gospels? What do you remember about what Lee Strobel and Craig Blomberg, the guy that he interviewed, what do you remember about what they said about who wrote the Gospels?
Matthew wrote Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
Mark wrote Mark.
Mm-hmm.
Luke wrote Luke and Acts.
Mm-hmm.
And John wrote John.
You got it. Nailed it. Yeah.
Who wrote Luke?
Luke wrote Luke. Yeah.
Luke's and Acts.
So this is kind of a funny sort of situation. So traditionally, the four Gospels are attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So, they kind of make it easy for you, right? In your Bible, the Gospel of Matthew is listed out as the Gospel of Matthew, or the Gospel according to Matthew. The book of Mark is listed out as the Gospel according to Mark. Luke is the Gospel according to Luke. John is the Gospel according to John. Now, Craig Blomberg says something maybe kind of shocking about the four Gospels. Do you remember what that is?
John is the only gospel about which there's a question of authorship.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so John, it's not entirely clear which John wrote the Gospel of John, right? So,
yeah. Is this the same John that wrote Revelation?
That is the question. So there's a question whether...
Or is it the other John he's talking about?
Yeah, so there's a question about whether this is John the Apostle or John the Elder. Remember that? So in the first and second centuries, there are writings. One writing is by a guy named Papias. Another writing is by a guy named Irenaeus. There are other writings by a guy named Polycarp and a whole bunch of other first and second century church leaders. And they talk about at least two different Johns. One of the Johns is the John who walked with Jesus. That's John the Apostle. The other John is a guy named John the Elder. Now, we don't know actually whether those are two people or whether it's one person that's just referred to multiple different ways. You know how kind of some people... So you can refer to Sylvester Stallone by different names, right? You could call him Sly, right? You could call him the Italian Stallion. You could call him the guy who played Rambo. Right? So people will refer to Sylvester Stallone by different names. It's entirely possible that people refer to John by different names. It's possible that some people called him John the Elder. It's possible that some people called him John the Apostle. Or it's possible that there were two prominent Johns working in the early church. But the reason any of this matters is because some early writings refer to the Gospel of John as having been written by John the Apostle. Some of the early Christian writings refer to the Gospel of John as having been written by John the elder. Same thing is true of the letters of John, so like 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Same thing is true of Revelation. There's a little bit of question, there's a little bit of debate over whether John, the 3 letters of John in the book of Revelation were written by John the Apostle or John the Elder. Personally, I think, as far as I can tell, it seems like these 2 guys are probably the same guy, and they're probably the Apostle John who walked with Jesus. So, in my opinion, I think that the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Revelation were all written by John the Apostle.
Would that be John the Baptist?
So actually, no. So John the Baptist would be an additional John. So there's a lot of Johns back in the day. There's a joke that back in 1st century Palestine, if you threw a rock, you'd hit somebody named John, right? So John the Baptist was Jesus' cousin. He was beheaded by King Herod, probably AD 31, maybe 32. John the disciple, he was considerably younger. He lived probably like AD maybe 100. So he would have lived a very, very long time after the death of Jesus, a very long time after the death of Paul, after the death of the rest of the apostles. He actually probably died of old age. The kind of folk history, we have no idea how accurate it is, but the kind of folk history of the Apostle John is that he was arrested multiple times. He was poisoned, and he survived it. Then they boiled him alive, and then he survived that. Then they tried to behead him, and they literally couldn't get his head to come off. And so eventually they just sent him out to the island of Patmos and exiled him. But somehow he got off of Patmos and got back to Asia, where he was pastoring, and got back to his church and got back to the work of ministry, and eventually just died at a ripe old age of something. So John lived a really, really long time. He's actually the only of the apostles to have, at least as the folk history, as it died of old age. And so yeah, there's a little bit of question about that. But there's another thing that's a little bit shocking that Craig Blomberg and Lee Strobel say about the 4 Gospels. Does anybody remember what the really kind of shocking thing is? He says that all 4 Gospels are technically anonymous. All 4 Gospels are technically anonymous.
I didn't get that either.
Yeah, so if I wrote something and then I published it, but I didn't put my name on it, that would be anonymous. One thing you'll notice in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is that at no point in any of those books do the authors actually name themselves. Right? Think about like the writings of Paul. So Romans, Galatians, Ephesians, all of them. He always starts out by saying, I, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, and so forth, right? Or at the very end, he says, it's me, Paul, I'm signing this in my own handwriting, so you know it's really me, right? Those books are not anonymous. Now, the book of Hebrews is anonymous, because whoever wrote Hebrews, maybe Paul, maybe somebody else, didn't put their name on that. But the writings of Paul, he always puts his name on it. He always tells you who he is. Same thing is true in Revelation. Right? Revelation, he identifies himself as John. Doesn't say which John, but, I don't always designate which Ryan I am, right? So, that's not the case with the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, at no point does the author ever name himself. But in the early church, there was basically unanimous agreement that this first gospel was written by Matthew, the tax collector who walked with Jesus. There was basically unanimous agreement that Mark was written by John Mark, the guy who traveled with Paul and Barnabas and then eventually had to go home because he couldn't handle how brutal the missionary life was. There was pretty much unanimous agreement that this third gospel was written by Luke, the Gentile physician and historian / kind of journalist who had traveled with Paul for quite a while near the end of his missionary journeys. And there was pretty much unanimous agreement that the book of John was written by somebody named John. That's how they got their names. The early church went through a pretty rigorous investigative process to figure out who wrote this gospel, who wrote this gospel, who wrote this gospel, who wrote this gospel. And they came to the conclusions that this one was Matthew, this one was Mark, this one was Luke, this one was John, and therefore they named them the Gospel of Matthew. They didn't come out of the tin called the Gospel of Matthew, right? Like Matthew didn't finish up his touch or, finish up his manuscript and say, what should I call this? Matthew, right? He wrote a gospel, and then he sent it out to whatever church he was connected with, and then that church copied it and sent it out to some more churches, and then that church copied it and sent it out to some more churches, and once they became kind of well accepted among the churches, it became really important to clearly identify for all time who had written this. And so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So they're technically anonymous, but the earliest churches determined, based on kind of a rigorous investigative process, that these were the authors. That's why they have those names. Now, why does it matter who wrote the Gospels? I agree.
Well, for one thing, this was their eyewitness of what happened.
There we go. Yes.
It gives them validity, I think.
Gives them validity, yeah. Were you going to say something, Connie?
Well, just that they were sharing who Jesus was on this earth.
Mm-hmm.
It's an important foundation
Yeah,
for faith.
exactly. And so you take those three things together. If the four Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that means, at the very least, in the case of Matthew and John, these are valid eyewitness documents where people who literally walked with Jesus during their lives share who Jesus was from their own experience, right? These are valid eyewitness documents where people share who Jesus was based on their own experiences with Jesus. Now, what we're going to find is that Mark is also an eyewitness document because you might remember from this chapter in the book, Papias, that's an early church leader, he recounted how Mark sat down with Peter, conducted a bunch of interviews with Peter about his time with Jesus in the ministry of Jesus, and then he wrote out his gospel based on the things that Peter said. And then Luke is also an eyewitness document because Luke went around as a journalist, and he conducted interviews probably with Mary, probably with people who were there when the miracles of Jesus were performed. He went around and he talked to people, and then he put his gospel together based on what the people said. And so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all of them are literally eyewitness documents where they share who Jesus was from their experience in a way that gives what they write validity, right? It's kind of like if you share an eyewitness testimony of something in court, it's probably going to be admissible as evidence, right? In the same way, these are eyewitness testimonies about Jesus in roughly the same way that you might give an eyewitness testimony today. So it matters deeply who wrote the Gospels. Even though they're technically anonymous, even though they never name themselves, based on what information is available, it looks very much like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were actually written by Matthew, the tax collector, Mark, the partner of Paul and Barnabas, Luke, the physician and historian who went with Paul on his missionary journeys, and John, the apostle. More than anything, though, we have very good reasons to believe that the early church was right when they attributed these, right? So one thing that a lot of people like to say is that the early church just kind of churned out a whole bunch of gospel documents about the life of Jesus so they could sort of shape the story of Jesus, to kind of say what they want to say about it. Does that make sense? A lot of people say that the early church invented a whole bunch of stuff about Jesus. So they wrote the 4 Gospels to rewrite the life of Jesus to kind of fit their theology, fit their beliefs. Have you ever heard anybody say that Jesus was a good man, but he wasn't God, right? They'll say that Jesus was a good man, but he wasn't anybody's savior, right? That he was a wise man who taught important things about loving your neighbors or things like that, but that he didn't come down from heaven. That's what a lot of people believe. And they believe that the early church took this good man, Jesus, and they created a whole mythology around him. Like, you ever seen the Da Vinci Code? It's an awesome movie, but it's ridiculous. So, they believe that Jesus was this good man. He was a good teacher. He was a wise servant of God that the early church then mythologized, is the word that they like to use. There's your $10 word for the day, right? They say they mythologized Jesus. They caked a bunch of myth around the life of Jesus so that now Jesus is the Son of God, so that now Jesus is a sacrifice for your sins, so that now Jesus is the center of a religion, when in reality all he was kind of an ethical teacher, or something like that. So they'll say the early church wrote these 4 Gospels, and then they falsely attributed them to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Have you ever heard somebody say something along those lines? You're in a conversation with somebody about Jesus, and they say, look, you can't actually trust the 4 Gospels. The 4 Gospels were written way after the fact, and then they were just attributed to people who were there. But they were really just written by some priest or something.
I have a cousin who read the Da Vinci Code.
Yeah.
He turned his back on Jesus.
Mm.
And he still is that way. And his mom's praying for him. That his mom is the one that has cancer.
Wow.
She talked to me about that a lot yesterday. And the Da Vinci Code is why I even remembered it.
Yeah.
Destroyed his faith.
Mm. It's horrible.
Mm-hmm.
It's horrible. But yeah, so that's let's say that's kind of a conspiracy theory about the early church. Most people who aren't Christians, most people who believe that the Bible is fabricated or something like that, believe what is essentially a conspiracy theory. So they may hate other conspiracy theories, but they believe at least one big conspiracy theory. There's a conspiracy theory that the early church fabricated these 4 Gospels and then falsely attributed them to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Problem is, it doesn't actually make any sense to say that they falsely attributed the Gospels to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Does anybody remember why? Lee Strobel says. So, it doesn't actually make any sense to say that the early church falsely attributed these books to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Do you remember why Lee Strobel says it doesn't make sense to say that these are falsely attributed?
I read it, but I can't remember.
That's okay. It's also an awkwardly worded question. One of the problems with this particular topic is that there's not a natural way to word a lot of these things, right? No matter what, you have to use some kind of weird jargon. So basically, here's what it comes down to. If you were going to make up a gospel, and then you were going to falsely say, this person from the early days of Christianity wrote it, Matthew was a bad choice, right? Matthew was a really bad choice, because Matthew was a tax collector. Now, you might think you hate the IRS. You might think you hate the government. You don't. Believe me, you do not. Because our government and our tax system is nothing compared to the oppressiveness of the Roman government and the Roman tax system. So much so that people hated tax collectors so aggressively much that if you were a tax collector or you were a former tax collector, so you're not even a tax collector anymore, right? You may have given up your life of tax collecting, but if you had ever even been a tax collector and you were traveling, because you had to travel in groups, right? Back in the day, they didn't have airplanes, they didn't have taxi cabs, you had to get in a boat with a whole bunch of other people you didn't know, and you had to sail around to the other island or something like that, right? So if you were traveling and you had ever been a tax collector, you did whatever you had to do to hide that fact. Because if you didn't, the people with you would tie you up, torture you, and throw you overboard to be eaten by the fish. That's how much people hated both present and former tax collectors. It's like being a tax collector was a stain you could not remove from a societal standpoint, right? It's kind of like being somebody who likes pineapple on their pizza today. Yeah. So Matthew was a former tax collector. Now let me ask you, if you wrote a fake gospel and you wanted to attribute it to somebody who would give it an air of authority, would you pick the former tax collector?
No.
No. You'd have to be the dumbest person in the world, right? So, for one, the fact that we attribute this to Matthew suggests that either the early church was filled with the dumbest people in the world, or it was just actually written by Matthew. Now, maybe you do think the people in the early church were just the dumbest people in the world, but they probably weren't. Come on. And so, more likely than anything, Matthew was actually written by Matthew. You can do the same thing for Mark. Mark was a minor character, right? Mark pops up a couple times in the book of Acts, and he doesn't even look very good when he does, right? He looks like a coward. He's on the missionary journey with Paul and Barnabas. We literally just went over this on Sundays, and the heat gets too much for him, and so he runs back home with his tail between his legs. He's not the kind of guy you're just out here canonizing, right? He's not the kind of guy you're just out here looking up to. I mean, it makes perfect sense to get overwhelmed in a long-term missionary journey and leave and go home. Like, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but you're not going to be everybody's hero after that, right? John Mark is the picture of mediocrity. And so if you wrote a fake gospel and you wanted to attribute it to somebody from the earliest church who would give it an air of authority, would you pick Mark? No.
They don't have any motivation.
Yeah, exactly. We can do the same thing with Luke and John for entirely different reasons. And in fact, we can actually see in the second and third and fourth centuries, in the early days, back before the Bible was fully compiled and then broadly accepted by all the churches throughout the world, people were writing fake gospels. And you know what they were doing? They were attributing them to Peter. They were attributing them to Paul. They were attributing them to James. They were attributing them to Mary. The list goes on. They were picking the greatest hits reel, right? They were picking the A-list, and then they were attributing their gospels to them. But those gospels didn't make it into the Bible. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the book for a whole set of obvious reasons. The main reason is that none of them tell an even basically coherent story. Like, there's this myth that when the Bible was compiled, they went through and they found all the books that served their purpose, and then they got rid of all the books they didn't like. But that's not actually how it would have gone. They had the easiest editorial job in the world. All they had to do was take the stuff that told a basically coherent story, and their job was done. Like, go home, look up the Gospel of Peter. Go home, look up the Gospel of Thomas. Go home, look up the Gospel of Mary. Look up the Gospel of James. Do all of that if you want. Read it and tell me, does this scream hidden truth the church doesn't want you to know, or does this scream this person was deranged and maybe on meth? Right? The alternate gospels that didn't make it into the Bible are absolute nonsense, but they were all attributed to heavy hitters. They were all attributed to exactly the people you would attribute your fake gospel to if you were trying to fake the gospel. It's not that way with the actual 4 canonical gospels. They were attributed to mostly second stringers that you wouldn't reach for if you were trying to fake a gospel. They were attributed to the tax collector. They were attributed to the third string intern that Paul and Barnabas had, who ran away. They were attributed to some Greek dude that you hear about once or twice in Acts, and that's about it. The only one that even kind of fits that bill was John. So who wrote the Gospels? Probably Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Probably exactly who the church has been saying wrote the Gospels for the last 2,000 years. That's all kind of heavy stuff, but does that make sense? Okay. Now, when were the Gospels written?
A long time ago.
First and second century.
Okay. So you're that's good. Yeah. So very, very early, right? So
AD 125.
you're close. So in AD 125, Papias is writing out, I don't even remember what it is. It's like a letter he's writing to another church leader. And he's talking about the books that his church uses in worship. So this is early on in the days of the church. Like I said before, the Bible hasn't been fully compiled together yet. And so this church might have these books, and that church might have those books, and that church over there might have a different set of books, right? We all have some books. Nobody has all the books. Part of the reason they compiled the Bible together was to get all the books that are generally agreed upon to be used in worship, right? And to be used in devotion, all bound together in one thing, and then circulated to all the churches, so we all have the same thing to work with, right? It's kind of like getting everybody on the same page. But so Papias is writing a letter, and he's writing about the books that his church has in its possession that they use for worship. And one of the books that he talks about is Matthew, one is Mark, one is Luke, one is John, and he goes through the story of how they got those books, and then he goes through the story of how those books were written. But what that tells us is AD 125, Papias mentions Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and that tells us that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have to be earlier than what? AD 125, right? Like if somebody talks about your book in AD 125, that means your book existed before AD 125. So they are earlier than AD 125. Now, it would take way too long to go through the whole long process, but there's basically 2 potential timelines. When you look at all the available evidence from all the available documents from the early couple centuries after Jesus, the earliest centuries of the church, what you find is that at the absolute latest, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, at the very latest, date to about AD 80. At the very least. Now this is the, let's say, kind of liberal take on it. So the kind of liberal take on the dating of the Gospels would be that Mark is probably dated to the 50s or 60s. That Luke is probably dated to the 60s or 70s. That Matthew is probably dated somewhere between the 50s and the 70s. And then that John, they'll usually put in the 90s somewhere. Now, this is too simple, but let's say that the sort of conservative take would put Mark probably in the 40s. I think that's probably much more accurate. It would put Luke probably in the 60s. And we'll put Matthew probably in the 50s. Now, interestingly enough, the conservative approach would probably put the Gospel of John in the 90s as well. So we're probably all agreed that the Gospel of John comes somewhere in the 90s, 80, 90 through 99, somewhere in that time. So, the four Gospels were written at the very earliest, beginning in the 40s, at the very latest, beginning in the 50s or 60s. Now, what do you notice about that timeline?
These was written after Jesus died.
Yeah, so they're all written after Jesus died. That's good. That's one half of the equation. There's a second half that I'm looking for. They're written after Jesus died. How long after Jesus died?
Well, they said that he died in the 30s.
Yeah, exactly. So he died in the 30s. That's right.
Yeah.
So if Jesus died in the 30s, let's assume that the kind of liberal approach to the dating of the Gospels is correct. Let's just to play devil's advocate. Let's assume that. If Jesus died in the 30s, and Mark was written in the 50s or 60s, how long after Jesus died were the Gospels written?
Not long. 40s, that'd be 7 years.
Yeah. So if you take even if you assume it's pretty late, 20 or 30 years. So the first gospel shows up at the latest 20 or 30 years after the death of Jesus. Now, if you take the kind of conservative approach, then it's more like 10 years after the death of Jesus. But let's assume, just to throw people a bone, let's assume the earliest gospel was written 20 or 30 years after the death of Jesus, and the latest gospel was written 60 years after the death of Jesus.
It was also written after he rose from the dead.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Death and resurrection. Yeah, that's exactly right.
So they saw him die, and then they saw him arise.
Yeah.
He appeared to many people, right?
Mm-hmm. You got it. That's exactly right. Now, the reason that we're lingering so long on this dating is because I want to point out how unbelievably different this is than what you typically hear. Because what you typically hear is the Gospels were written what? Hundreds of years after Jesus, right? Usually what you hear is the Gospels were written hundreds of years after the fact by people who weren't there and just made stuff up. But this is very different than that, isn't it? Because it's not hundreds of years, it's tens of years. It's a few decades after Jesus, not by strangers, not by theologians, not by a bunch of priests getting in a room and making stuff up, but by people who were literally there, and people who interviewed the people who were there. So what we have in the four Gospels is books written a couple of decades after Jesus by people who were there or interviewed the people who were there. What does that sound like? Sounds like a modern biography, doesn't it?
It's like truth.
Yeah. Sounds like truth. So let me ask you, so John Lennon died about 40 years ago. If somebody wrote a John Lennon biography and it came out tomorrow, would you say, no point reading that? He died 40 years ago. You can't possibly say anything true about John Lennon 40 years after his death. No. Yeah.
You can. It's
Of course you
not that
can.
long ago.
It was 40 years ago, right? A new Martin Luther King Jr. biography just came out. Martin Luther King Jr. died in the 1960s, If you subtract the 1960s from the 2020s, you get what?
60.
That's 60 years. So the Martin Luther King Jr. biography that just came out this past week is further removed from the life of Martin Luther King Jr. than any of the four Gospels are from the life of Jesus. The life of Jesus, literally, at maximum, was 60 years before the writing of the last of the Gospels. So the Gospels were literally closer to the life of Jesus than probably any MLK biography you could read today. Any John Lennon biography you could read today. And so, just as a compare and contrast kind of thing, Alexander the Great. Remember when they start talking about Alexander the Great in our chapter? So the earliest biography of Alexander the Great, so the great Greek emperor, the earliest biographical works we have of Alexander the Great came about 400 years after he died. Just to put that into perspective, almost everything we know about Alexander the Great was written about 400 years after he died. Now, does Alexander the Great show up in our history books? Yeah, of course he does. How could he not, right? He's a pivotal figure in history. And yet, basically everything we know about him comes from biographies written hundreds of years after him. Now, when you read your high school history book or whatever, and they start talking about Alexander the Great, does it say, now we don't know if any of this is true because it was written hundreds of years after him? Or does it just say, and then Alexander the Great did this, and then Alexander the Great did this, and then Alexander the Great did this? It's the second one, right? Even though the earliest information we have about Alexander the Great comes 400 years after his death, we still use those sources, and we still basically trust them. Now compare that to the four Gospels, which were written maybe 20, maybe 30, maybe 40, maybe 50, maybe 60 years after his death. Not just one biography of Jesus, but four biographies of Jesus written in very different parts of the Roman Empire. Matthew was writing from over here. Mark was writing from over here. Right? Luke was writing from over here. John was writing from an island. And this was not an information age, right? They didn't have the internet. And so they're writing from different corners of the world, so it would have taken years for their writings to spread out and be widely available, and yet we have these four Gospels that say basically the same things about this one guy. We have these four biographies written just decades after him from different parts of the world that say basically the same things about him, that were written by people who either witnessed the events or interviewed people who witnessed the events. Let me ask you, do you think that those four biographies are going to be pretty accurate, or do you think those four biographies are going to be pretty sloppy?
Accurate.
It'll be pretty accurate. That's right. So that leads to the third question that Lee Strobel tackles in the chapter. Are the Gospels accurate?
Yes.
Yeah, I think the answer is very obviously yes. Are the Gospels accurate? I think the answer, based on this information, is very obviously yes. But the general consensus is still no, for some reason, right? Among a lot of secular historians, among a lot of just secular people in general, the answer that people usually give to this question is no. You ask the average person, like, are the Gospels accurate? They're probably going to say, well, I think there's probably some truth in them, but there's also a whole lot of, like stuff they made up. There's also a whole lot of like myth. There's a lot of legend. There's a lot of folklore, stuff like that. Right? People treat the Gospels like they're basically sort of fairy tales, like you would tell your children as bedtime stories back in the day. But if you actually use the Gospels as bedtime stories for your kids, they're going to have nightmares. But,
Yeah, I think it's.
yeah. But so based on this information, the answer to are the Gospels accurate seems pretty obviously to be yes, and yet most people, most of the time, still answer that question no. Why?
Because they haven't been taught the truth.
Well,
And I
one
was
thing, there was no dispute to the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There was no dispute to what they wrote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, there was nothing to dispute what they wrote. Yeah.
Well, when I was a little girl, my daddy said, the Bible says it, I believe it, and that settles it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
it's how you're brought up, is
Mhm.
how you answer that question.
Sure. Yeah. That's exactly right.
Today's society isn't as fixed in Jesus as we were taught to.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so those are both factors. That's exactly right. Now, I think the biggest single element to why most people still answer no when you ask, are the Gospels accurate, is because the stuff you read in the Gospels just seems implausible, right? So if we had any other document that was written by eyewitnesses or people who interviewed eyewitnesses, and it was written just decades after the event, we probably wouldn't doubt it at all, right? But we're not talking about any document. We're talking about a document that has a guy who miraculously heals people, who casts out demons, who raises the dead from their tombs, and who ultimately dies and is resurrected. All those things sound really implausible. All those things are really difficult to swallow. All those things are really tough to believe. They just sound fake, right? Like if you talk to somebody today, I mean, let's be honest, if you talk to somebody today and they said they witnessed somebody get their head chopped off at Sheets, then put it back on and kind of screw it back on, like the movie The Exorcist, they do it like that in reverse, And then they got up and they paid for their milkshake. You'd be skeptical, right? Makes sense. We're naturally skeptical of supernatural claims. We just are. That's a good thing most of the time. Because most of the time when somebody makes a supernatural claim to you, they're probably jerking your chain. But it's just part of our nature as humans. We're naturally skeptical of supernatural claims. It was the same back in the day as it is today. People didn't just say like, oh, you did a miracle? Yeah, that must be true, right? Back then they were skeptical of things too, right? And so we have these documents that record supernatural claims. We have these documents that record resurrections. We have these documents that record difficult things to believe and accept. And so even though we have all of this, and even though all of this would point to the accuracy of the four Gospels, we still have a hard time coming to the obvious conclusion and saying, yes, of course, the Gospels are accurate. And so, conspiracy theories grow up around the Gospels. We say that the church invented the miracles of Jesus. We say that the church invented the divinity, right, the godhood of Jesus. We say that the church invented the resurrection of Jesus. We say that the Gospels are filled with inventions by the early church.
Why would they do that?
Yeah. Why would they do that? That's true. The thing is, if you look at the Gospels and you look at all the other available documents and evidence of the time, it becomes really, really unlikely that the church invented any of this. There's only a few things want to talk about because I want to get you out of here before lunchtime, right? We could talk about this all day, but the four Gospels were written in the middle of the first century. But there are countless documents from much earlier that corroborate the difficult claims of the Gospels. So even though the Gospels are filled with unlikely sounding things, there are profoundly early documents that corroborate even those unlikely things. Do you remember any of what Lee Strobel and Craig Blomberg pointed to when they were talking about this? Let's talk about three specific things. First things first, I want to talk about the early church's hymns and creeds. The early church's hymns and creeds. Anybody remember this from the chapter? That's okay. So, you'll learn a lot about what somebody believes based on what they sing, right? You'll learn a lot about what somebody believes based on their creed, right? So every Sunday morning we sing a handful of worship songs and we're singing out our beliefs. You know what I'm talking about? We're singing out the things that we believe. One of the things that music does is it almost tricks your heart into believing things you struggle to believe in your head. Does that make sense? You may intellectually struggle with certain elements of the faith, but then you start to sing them out, and it's like it connects with that part of you that knows the truth. It connects with that place in your soul that God has placed a desire for himself. So you learn a lot about what somebody believes in the deepest parts of themselves based on their music, based on what they sing. And the same thing is true for the early church. There are 2 hymns and 1 creed that we find in the New Testament. The first one, you can find it in Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 20. Colossians 1, 15 through 20. Can anybody read Colossians 1, verses 15 through 20 for me? This is in a book written by Paul, but you'll notice that it's probably bracketed and kind of indented over as a block quote. The reason they're doing that is because Paul is pulling from an early Christian hymn that predates Paul himself. Paul is pulling from an early Christian song that churches would get together and sing. Colossians 1, 15 through 20. Somebody read that out for me.
I don't mind reading it, but I read out of the Message, and it's very up to date in English.
That's fine. That's fine.
We look at this sun, and we see the God who cannot be seen. We look at this sun and see God's original purpose in everything created. For everything, absolutely everything, above and below, visible and invisible, rank after rank after rank of angels, everything got started in him and finds its purpose in him. He was there before any of it came into existence, and he holds it all together right up to this moment. And when it comes to the church, he organizes and holds it together like a head does a body. He was supreme in the beginning and leading the resurrection parade. He is supreme in the end. From beginning to end, he's there, towering far above everything and everyone. So spacious is he, so expansive, that everything of God finds its proper place in him without crowding. Not only that, but all the broken and dislocated pieces of the universe, people and things, animals and atoms, get properly fixed and fit together in vibrant harmonies, all because of his death, his blood that was shed and poured down from the cross.
Thank you. translation might put that a little differently.
It's just a steady translation.
Yeah. But even if your translation puts that a little differently, the point is the same, right? The image of Jesus is the same. And the reason why that matters is because what Miss Connie just read, that was an early Christian worship song. That was an early Christian hymn. Now specifically, that's an early Christian hymn that was apparently old enough for Paul to be able to quote in Colossians and just assume that everybody who's reading would already know it. Now, in order for that to be the case, it has to be kind of old, right? If you're going to sing out a song and just be able to assume that everybody else also knows the words, it has to be kind of old, right? Like if I start singing Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA, you'll probably know the words. But if I sing the new Jay-Z song, you may or may not, right? And so Paul's quoting a Springsteen song, not a Jay-Z song. He's quoting a classic song, not a new song. He's quoting something that was widely known and widely sang in the earliest churches. And he wrote Colossians probably in the mid-50s. And so if this song was old in the 50s, and this song must date back to the 40s, maybe even the 30s. So if the earliest Christians, if Christians in the 30s were singing out Colossians 1, 15 through 20 as worship songs in the 30s, that means they were already singing to Jesus as God in the 30s. So a couple years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, Christians were already singing hymns about how Jesus created the world. That means that even by the time Mark starts writing in the 40s or 50s, the things that he writes are already old news. By the time Paul starts writing in the mid-40s, the theology that he's pushing, the high view of Jesus that he's preaching is already old hat. It means that Paul's not innovating. It means that the Gospels aren't innovating. They're not being creative. They're taking what the church has already believed deeply enough to sing as early as the 30s. And they're just expanding on it and explaining it. That means that everything we see in the Gospels is well attested all the way back to the first couple years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Compare that to Alexander the Great, where most of the biographies we have of him start to add flourishes and stuff, right? So the first biography, 400 years after his death, it plays it pretty straight. And then the next biography we have about 600 years after his death, suddenly Alexander has superpowers, right? Suddenly he can fly. Suddenly he's descended from the Greek gods. Suddenly he's living to be 500 years old. We see hundreds of years after the fact, in the case of Alexander, we see supernatural elements start to creep in. But it's not that way with Jesus. With Jesus, we see the supernatural elements are there from the beginning. There was no process where there was a human Jesus who was then corrupted and mythologized and then folklored and then legended into a divine Jesus. What we see from the very beginning is a human and divine Jesus, just like we see in Colossians 1, 15 through 20. Just like we see, I'm not going to have you read it, but just like we see in Philippians 2, 6 through 11, just like we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, from the very beginning, from the early 30s, from the moment after the resurrection, we have a human and divine Jesus who performs miracles, who created the world, who was God in the beginning and will be God all the way through the end, and who is a sacrifice for your sins. and who is supernaturally putting the world back together. When you look at the available evidence, not just what your grandma told you, not just what you were raised to believe, but when you look at the available evidence, what we have is a Jesus who fits the bill exactly to what the gospel writers portray him as. And so, the Gospels are trustworthy. The Gospels are trustworthy because they were written right after the events by people who watched them. So you can trust the Gospels.
You know, what's funny is people read a newspaper and believe everything they see in it, but they can't believe everything in the Bible.
Yeah. So are there any questions or comments that anybody would like to add? There's plenty more that we could talk about, but I want to condense it to about an hour max. So I'll still be here if there's anything else anybody wants to talk about. I'm happy to.
It's just simply amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is.
I do think it's a lot about what Connie said. She said it's how you grow up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when I grew up, I never doubted the Bible, never questioned the gospel.
Yeah.
It was taught to me. I believed it.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess it's the times we grew up into
Sure.
are different.
Mm-hmm.
I never questioned that the Bible wasn't true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that makes a significant difference. This is more sociology than apologetics, but there's actually a pretty wide pool of research that's been done specifically regarding the relationship with your upbringing and your religious life as an adult. One of the things that they have found is that the most likely people to grow up and remain Christian are people who specifically were raised in the faith by a dad who was active in practicing the faith. I'm about to drop some really, really upsetting news. If you are a kid and you grow up hearing your mom teach the Bible to you and sitting on grandma's knee being taught the faith and being taken to children's church every single Sunday, but you have a dad who stays home and doesn't really visibly practice his faith and doesn't go out of his way to teach it to you and raise you up in it, statistically, you are probably going to leave. Even when women are the primary teachers, because that's how it typically goes. Women are the primary teachers of children. Women take a primary role in teaching the faith to their children. That's almost universally true. It's been true since the first century as far as we can tell. Most of the religious teaching, most of the spiritual teaching that you get tends to come from the women in your lives. And yet, for whatever reason, when dad actively participates in that, it usually sticks. When dad does not, it usually doesn't. We don't know why that is. We don't know why dad is the often determining factor. Now, obviously, the role of the Holy Spirit and so on and so forth, that plays a significant role, right? The Lord works in your heart, but for whatever reason, generally speaking, in most cases that we've been able to observe through most of history, for whatever reason, God has chosen to work largely through dad. And so when dad is an absentee Christian, usually the kids walk away. Or if they don't walk away, they practice a kind of nominal faith where they do what they want, maybe say grace or something, right? Continually absent themselves from church. That is, I would say, probably a much larger part of why churches are declining in America than even the cultural changes that are happening outside the doors. I think the single largest part of why churches are declining is because dads are leaving the church stuff to the women in the family. The women are doing a wonderful job, but they can't be dad. The women are doing a fantastic job. The women are being unbelievably faithful, and yet, consistently, when dad is an absentee in the spiritual life of the spiritual life of the family dies after that generation. Or if it doesn't die after that generation, it dies a couple generations later. I don't know why this is. I don't know how it is that this is the case. I don't know what the significance is, but for whatever reason, when dad is an absentee Christian, it tends to just cut off the line of transmission. And what have you seen in churches throughout the U.S. for the last 30, 40, 50 years? You've seen a whole bunch of absentee dads. You've seen a whole bunch of absentee men in the churches. You've seen a whole bunch of the patriarchs of the churches completely abandoning any serious role or responsibility in training their kids up in the faith. And so as a result, regardless of what's happening in the culture out there, regardless of whether the culture is friendly or unfriendly to the faith, what happens is churches for women and children.
You know, in the Bible, God is equated to Father.
Mm-hmm.
And I, being a survivor of domestic violence, there was no father figure. And when children see a father who is a bad example, they don't want to reach out to God because they think he's going to do the same thing.
Sure.
This is a personal experience. There's all sorts of reasons, I'm sure. But you stop and think all throughout the Bible, God is referred to the Father.
Mm-hmm.
And if the Bible is taught and God the Father is mentioned, a child is going to visualize the Father they know, not the Father that is the good person.
Yeah.
And that can affect faith.
That's a great point. That's a really good point.
And it's very sad that the fathers do not accept the spiritual role that God gave them. I'm sure there's many, many other factors. That's just one small piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely.
But an important one, since God chose to refer to himself as Father.
That's true. That's exactly right. Yeah. And so, to bring back around to this, because you were talking about the role of upbringing, there was a point to everything I just said. All of this will be as convincing as a person lets it be, you know? And for whatever reason, this will be so much more convincing to your children or your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren if they are intentionally brought up in the faith by the entirety of their family, including their dad. I'm not trying to be deterministic, right? So don't make the mistake of thinking this is like a fatalistic, deterministic, this is what happens, so this is what's going to happen, right? It's not like that. There's not a one-to-one cause and effect ratio where if dad was an absentee, your grandkids are doomed, right? But this will be so much more effective in future generations of your family if the men in your family go out of their way to actively invest in raising them up in the faith. And this will be so much more difficult for them to swallow if he didn't. Once again, I don't know why it works this way. We just know that it works this way. We just know that the available sociological research that's gone into the relationship between upbringing and faith suggests that this is how it tends to go. And so if the men in your family who are currently raising kids right now, if they will actively invest in raising their kids up in the faith, then your kids will be so much more likely to be able to hear and accept truths like these as they get older. And if they don't, they'll be so much less likely. And it will be their fault. This is a kind of difficult pill I give to a lot of men. I know a lot of guys who are not connected to this church who they're in their early 50s now. Their kids have just gone off to college, and they've said things like, man, my daughter came home and she believes all these weird things and stuff like that. And I don't know, it's like she said she doesn't believe that Jesus was this. She's, all this stuff like that, right? She's gotten into all these weird philosophies. And one of the kind of difficult pills I tend to give them is, it's probably your fault. And they'll be like, what are you talking about? And I'll be like, how often did you go to church when they were kids? It was like, 6 times a year at least. And I was like, man, you really modeled that this is important to them, right? I'll be like, did you actively lead them in any kind of, devotional or any kind of Bible study or any kind of anything when they were kids? And they'll be like, well, no, man, of course not. That was their mom's thing. And I'll be like, okay, here's what the research says. You didn't lay a foundation for your kids. And the fact that you didn't lay that foundation made everything that your wife and her mom and your mom did so much less effective. For whatever reason, you were designed to be the glue that made that kind of thing stick, and you decided not to be the glue, and now your daughter is leaving the faith, and it's because of you. And they don't talk to me after that a lot of times. But people need to be told things that are difficult by somebody, somewhere. And so if I have to be the guy who gets punched in the face sometimes, then okay. But yeah, that's a thing. Upbringing really does have a lot to do with this. Now, the good news is upbringing is not everything. Upbringing is not final. Upbringing is not the thing that determines the entire rest of your life. You can have a dad who did everything that he should have done, and you can still fall away. Or you can have a dad who was absolutely an absentee, and you can still ultimately come back to the faith. This is just a general observation about how things generally work in most cases. It is not a one-to-one observation about here's how this works, here's what's going to happen, here's what you need to do, right? So upbringing plays a significant role in how receptive you will be to this kind of thing. So yeah.
The wonderful promise is prayer changes things.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. If you have kids who have fallen away, or grandkids who have fallen away, or nephews or whatever who have fallen away, your prayers are more effective than their upbringing. The power of God is more powerful than their upbringing. The work of the Spirit in their hearts is more effective than their upbringing. The reason I go so hard talking about the upbringing thing is because on the front end, I want to prepare people to do the smart thing, right? On the front end, I want to prepare people to actively invest, as the whole family, in their children's spiritual upbringing. But don't make the mistake of thinking that means that if you made mistakes as a parent yourself, that therefore all hope is lost, because your prayers are more powerful than your past mistakes, and your prayers are more powerful than maybe their dad's past absenteeism. And so even if their upbringing was not good, even if their upbringing was very much not ideal in terms of bringing them up in the faith, still your present tense prayers go a very long way. The work of the Spirit goes a very long way. And they can change. They can transform. They can turn around and go the other way. Your present life change through the Spirit can be the catalyst for that. So yeah. Is there anything else anybody wants to discuss? Okay. Well, then, would anybody like to pray to dismiss us? Only one. You can't. Don't fight.
I will.
Okay.
Father, we thank you for this day. Lord, we thank you for this time that Ryan has taken out of his time to help us to learn more about you and to read your word more. And Father, I just thank you that we have that opportunity to do this. Father, I pray for those that were spoken of that need healing. I pray that you would touch each one, be with all those that are sick.